Here I come. There we are. Hope that's working now. Actually, this really exciting title was suggested by David. So you can blame him. Now we can move forward. A few years ago, I was at a conference in London, an analytics conference, and got into a little conversation with Ian Graham, the director of research at Liverpool. And he told me this story about something that happened at the club. This analyst, who I should call Analyst A, and I want to emphasize Analyst A was not associated with Liverpool at all, but he wrote to the owner, John Henry, and he wrote him a little letter about Luis Suarez. By the way, A could stand for anonymous, it could stand for analyst, it could stand for American because the guy was American, and it could stand for one of his initials, or it could stand for all of them. So I'll leave you to puzzle that one out. I'm not going to say who he was. But he wrote to John Henry and he said, look, you know, I've been doing a bit of research about your striker, Luis Suarez. And what I found out is that when Luis Suarez is playing, you only win about 36% of your matches. And when he's not playing, you win 58% of your matches. So what I recommend is you know, get rid of Luis Suarez. So Ian Graham, who was still furious about this, said, you know, I had to spend 2 days of my life convincing John Henry to keep Luis Suarez. And he put another word in front of, a naughty word in front of life. Well, what this suggested to me was that it's very important to have a decent player rating system at your club and to have buy-in to it at all levels. You know, otherwise you have to spend time sort of fending off things that come from inside the club and from outside the club, because people get all sorts of ideas in their head about players. You know, that they're not performing when in fact the stats would show that, you know, they are performing. And you know, you do need a decent system to be able to sort of evaluate players. So Lars and I are sharing this thing. Lars is at Mulder University, and he and his students and his co-workers have produced a tremendous body of work actually on player rating systems. A lot of which has been peer reviewed and sort of is available to be examined. And I can't remember, maybe about 18 months ago we started collaborating. And this is me, as David has already said. And this is what we're going to be talking about. First of all, we're going to look at classifying methods for rating players, and this is not the best classification system in the world, I must admit, but it's just something to get us through this evening. Then Lars is going to talk about plus-minus ratings and how they're derived, and then we're going to go and look at the relationship between plus-minus ratings and event data, and seeing whether we can get better ratings by combining the two sorts of things. And then finally look at you know, features of, you know, what makes a good player rating system. So this is the way I've sort of decided to classify methods. Global would be the first kind of rating method, and there were sort of the key thing about that with global is you come out with one number that's supposed to represent the quality of the player or the contribution of the player or the ability of the player or something like that. So you're you know, not really digging into the various sort of components of the play, but you're trying to come up with a single number that represents the value of that player. Plus minus ratings is one example of that. Goal probability added, which is kind of behind VAEP thing that was presented last week. I'd say that's sort of really a global method. Then you've got sort of a sort of bottom up or event level type thing, and here you're sort of looking for key performance indicators or skills, and you end up with multiple numbers, radars and stuff like that. StatsBomb radars are quite famous, 12 player ratings. They also have radars, and you know, the key thing is you don't represent a player by one number, but you know, there's various numbers, each representing a different skill or something like that. And then there's this other thing I decided to put in. We won't be talking about it much, and you don't see it much, but I rather like it, and I just call it a latent variable method. So plus minus ratings. This is a global method, and it's defined as team performance when the player's on the pitch minus performance where he's not on the pitch. If you think back to that Luis Suarez, that was a kind of plus minus rating, but you know, it was a pathetic one. In order to use this equation to get reliable and meaningful ratings out from the data, you need to do a lot of sophisticated statistical analysis, and Lars is going to explain some of the stuff behind that, so I'm not going to talk about that one. Another type of global one is this goal probability added, which Ian Graham, you know, is a big fan of, and is behind VAEP. And this one works as was explained last week actually. You look at the probability of scoring in the near future from any particular part of the pitch, and then you see how that probability increases or decreases according to player actions, and the amount of increase or decrease is the value that they add for that particular action, and then you add that up or divide it by 10 or whatever, and you get the goal probability added for and normalize it by minutes played or something, and you get a value for that. The event level thing, these sort of radars, this is a 12. This is a David Sumter radar, and you see this is what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. There's about 16 different numbers characterizing that player, so it gives you, you know, a pretty good idea of what areas, you know, he is good in or does a lot of, and what areas he is not so good in or does not so much of. And then there's this other thing that I like, when you instead of just, you know, looking at an overall contribution or particular type of events, you actually group the events together, or you let the stats tell you which events should be grouped together. And if you look at event level data, you'll find that these particular events are always correlated. You know, if a guy does a lot of crosses or successful crosses, he'll also be doing a lot of assists, also this and also this and also this one. You can conceptualize that by saying, well, okay, if he's doing all these different things, and some players, you know, do a lot of them, and some players do a middling amount of them, and some players do not very much of them, what's happening is that behind the scenes you've got this other variable that you can't actually see. We call it a latent variable. These things, crosses, key passes, they're all things we can measure, but behind that is some latent variable there. And if the score on this latent variable is high, then the scores on all these individual things will be high. And if the score on the latent variable is low, then the score on all these individual things is low. And then you can say, well, what these things are actually measuring is or indicating or pointing to is this higher dimension, this variable that lives in a higher dimension that we don't know what it is, but we can kind of guess what it is, and it's probably something like creating chances. Okay, and when you do this, the stats on it, you do it, say something like a confirmatory, well, even a sort of exploratory factor analysis, but a confirmatory factor analysis would be better. You find that all these different events load onto that factor. So you've sort of identified something about the player from these lower level events, and and you can score the person instead of scoring them on all these events. You can score them on the latent variable. You see, here's another one. These things are all correlated in the data: midfield aerial duels, challenges, tackles, recoveries, and interceptions. And that looks like something like regaining possession. You might be able to kind of come up with a different sort of name for that latent variable. So that's that particular method. So now I'm going to hand back to Lars, and he's going to tell us about how plus-minus ratings are derived. So I'm going to stop sharing.
All right. Thank you, Garry, and thank you, David, for having me on your show. So I'm pleased to be here and talk a little bit about plus-minus ratings. So on this channel, you have already covered quite a lot about, let's see if I can get this to work. There you go. You have covered a lot about using tracking data, and you've covered a lot about using event data. So the question is, what do you do if you don't have that data? Or at least if you are interested in the league or in the club that is not covered by such data. So plus minus is what you can do if you only have like match sheet data. So essentially, you would know which players start the game. You would know when the goals are scored. You know when the substitutions are made. And you would know about any red cards and similar situations. So before we go into the details about plus minus rating, I have one slide here about a little bit of the history, just to tease you a little bit about where this comes from and how it has been developed over the years. So the concept of plus minus actually dates back to the 1950s. There was a coach in the NHL for the Montreal Canadiens that started using plus minus for players on his own team to evaluate them. And since sometime in the 1960s, plus minus scores have sort of been part of the official statistics for all the players in the NHL. But this was a very crude measure, and it's a bit similar to the Luis Suarez example of Garry, actually. So further developments were needed for this to be more effective. And that happened around the year 2000 by Wayne Winston and Jeff Sagarin, who worked in basketball and made a system that they sold to the Dallas Mavericks, where they created something that we now call adjusted plus minus, trying to rectify some of the drawbacks of the first initial plus minus models. The next development that I wanted to highlight on this slide is from 2010. So 10 years ago now, there was a presentation at Sloan conference where Joseph Sill sort of added one more important ingredient to be able to efficiently use plus minus principles to calculate ratings. And that's known as regularization. And I will come back to that when we go a little bit into the details of how the method works. And as Garry already mentioned, around 5 years ago, myself and some students, another of my coworkers, started testing this concept of plus minus for football. With sort of an open mind, does it work? Does it not work? And why does it not, or why does it work? And we have some insights with Garry regarding sort of how these ratings actually perform. So allow me to go a little bit into the details here, and let me start with basically the concept from the 1950s, which I label as the raw plus minus score. So essentially what you do to get the raw plus minus score for an individual football player is to look at the performance of the team when that player is on the pitch. So adding up the goals scored by the team when the player is on the pitch and subtracting the goals conceded by the team when the player is on the pitch. So if you play for a good team and you score more goals than you concede, then your score will be a positive number. And if you play for a bad team and you concede more goals than you score, your number will be a negative number. This, of course, as a method to evaluate players, has a lot of drawbacks. For example, it doesn't compensate for the fact that you could be playing with rubbish players or world-class players, right? So your performance is, according to this measure, will be influenced a lot by your teammates. And in around year 2000 in basketball, we got the developments that led up to adjusted plus minus, trying to compensate for the fact that you are on a team with some teammates and you play against different types of opposition players. So I will try to avoid going into too much details in this presentation about the mathematics, because I don't think there's time to sort of do justice to that. But the idea here is to use a regression model. And so let me just briefly explain how this regression model works. So essentially, you look at different observations. And in basketball, one observation could be a possession for a team, for example. Let me explain the type of observation that we use for soccer or football. Here we look at a match and then we divide it into segments. And these segments are such that the players on the pitch are the same throughout the segment. So essentially we start a segment when the match starts, and this segment lasts until either there is a substitution or there is a red card. When that happens, the players on the pitch will change, and so we start a new segment. And then this will divide a match into typically somewhere around 6, 7, or 8 different segments, given that there are at most 6 substitutions. Sometimes several substitutions happen at once, and there could be some red cards in addition to that. So for each of these observations, we have sort of a left-hand side and a right-hand side in this equation here. So if we look at the right-hand side first, that's basically what we want to use in the measurement of the rating. So for the systems that we will discuss here today, we have used the goal difference. So if you look at the segment, then you will observe a goal difference in that segment. So it could be that the segment ends without goals, and then the goal difference is 0, for example. Now we want to find ratings for the players. And so the left-hand side here essentially says that you are adding up the ratings of, say, the home team, and you're subtracting the ratings of the away team. And the goal is to find ratings so that this sum of the ratings of the home team's players minus the ratings of the away team players is as close as possible to the observed goal difference in the segment. And the notation is defined under here. So basically this epsilon here is basically the error, so the mismatch if you are not able to perfectly match the ratings with the observed goal differences. This takes care of the fact that you could be playing together with very good players, or you could be playing against very bad players. So some of your goal difference will be reflected by your teammates and the opposition. This system, however, has its drawbacks as well. In particular, there is, from the perspective of the mathematics here, collinearity. So many of the variables, which are then, or many of the independent variables, which correspond to players being present or not on the pitch, are correlated. So if you imagine a team, many of the players will often play together. And so in your entire linear regression model, many of the columns are similar. And if you estimate the model using the ordinary least squares method, you're basically minimizing this sum of quadratic terms here. Your ratings will be very noisy because of this collinearity. So what happened in 2010 at the Sloan conference was that Joseph Sill proposed that we should use regularization. So this is known as ridge regression or Tikhonov regularization. And the trick is, in addition to estimating the ratings using this linear regression, we will penalize the ratings by a quadratic term, so that if we don't know anything about the player, his rating will be close to 0. So essentially it means that 0 is, in this system, interpreted as an average player. And then you can have players that are better or that could be worse. But you sort of need to observe matches over time where they outperform their expectation. Then the model will credit them with a larger rating. And if they underperform, they will get a lower rating. So this regularization term means that we will get less noise in the estimates for the ratings. So this works fairly well for basketball, and it has been used for ice hockey. The question is, can we adapt it to football? And even the regularized plus minus that we presented on the last slide has some issues when it comes to football. First of all, there are very few goals. So many of the observations are sort of just a 0 goal difference. Even though a good team is playing against a bad team, the goal difference is for many segments 0, or at least very small difference. There are also relatively few lineup changes. So there are only 6 substitutions, and that means you don't have very much going on in terms of observing the performance of the teams this way. To get a good rating system and to use the most possible information, we must also deal with the fact that sometimes there are missing players from the pitch. So someone has been shown a red card and is not there anymore. And as opposed to the American sports where plus minus arose, we have a different league system, right? So we have promotions, we have relegations, we have different league systems in different countries. And there is some interaction between different league systems in different countries, but there is not too much. So to deal with some of these issues and to use plus minus to find ratings for players in football, it seems important to use many seasons of data and to use several divisions and league systems at once to get enough information, to get enough observations about the different players. That again leads to some other issues, such that the players' abilities changing over time, and the fact that we then must assess what are the differences between different leagues. So I will now present some slides where I show basically the core workings of the plus-minus system that Garry and I analyzed. And again, there are some formulas on these slides. I will try not to focus too much on the mathematics here. But basically, the development was starting from the 1950s, where we just calculated these raw scores, to the 2000 when we started using regression models, and then 2010 where we started using regularized regression models. For soccer, we are now presenting what is basically an optimization model. So we have gone from these regression models and sort of generalized them until we are left with basically minimizing a quadratic objective function in order to find the ratings. So depending on how we've defined the ingredients here, we could go back to the standard adjusted plus-minus rating model, or we could go back to the regularized adjusted plus-minus rating model, but we can also do more. And we do some slight changes here to accommodate for some of the challenges that we have when calculating this type of ratings for football players. Right, so a few of the things that we do to adapt this to football is, first of all, if you recall that the observations here are basically segments in a match. So we are splitting a match up into 6, 7, 8 segments and then using that as our observations. Not all observations are equally important to calculate ratings for current day players. So we introduce weights for these segments, and these weights can be based on things such as the time since the match was played. So essentially, if you have an observation that dates back to 10 years ago, and you want to find how good the player is today, Probably more recent matches are more important, and so you put more emphasis, more weight on the more recent observations rather than those from the past. The duration of the segment is also part of our ingredients here to determine these weights. Essentially, shorter segments are perhaps less informative about the relative strength of the players involved in that segment. So we decide to use smaller weights for those segments. And there is also a weight adjustment based on the goal difference when the segment starts, which could be related to how important that segment is for the outcome of the match. So this slide is just to say that we in the initial model, in the initial plus-minus model, we basically have one variable for every player, and the value of that variable corresponds to the rating of the player. So in our model, we have some additional variables, and therefore we sort of split in the variables into some variables that are related to the players, some variables that are related to the segment itself, that could influence your expected outcome in that segment, and some that are related to the match itself. As an example of something that is related to the match itself would be the home team advantage. So you have some matches where one of the teams have a home field advantage. And so you could include a variable in your model that estimates how much is this home field advantage in terms of adjusting the ratings. And this home team advantage could vary depending on the type of the competition, for example. Including this home field advantage does not make a big impact on the resulting ratings though. So it's kind of a little bit cosmetic because most players play a similar amount of matches at home as they do away. And therefore things will cancel out in terms of creating a rating for the player. But we include it in the model and it makes sense to have it there, even though it doesn't influence the ratings themselves too much. This slide is just showing how we deal with players that are missing due to red cards. And it's a little bit technical, but basically we adjust the ratings of the remaining players so that they are similar. And then we add some terms representing the penalty for each team of having a red card. So basically a missing player. And this way we can, at the same time as we estimate ratings for the players, we can also estimate what is the impact of a red card. So how much is a red card worth in terms of number of goals per minute played. Another adjustment that we put in is to do with the age of the players. So since we are using many seasons of data to calculate these ratings, and we basically need to do that in order to get enough information about the players, we can no longer assume that the strength of the player is constant over that time period. So we include some terms in the models to estimate how much the ratings are influenced by simply the age of the player. So assuming that a young player has not reached the peak potential yet, and his or her rating will climb until they reach sort of a peak age. And then when they get older, they will tend to deteriorate and get a lower rating simply because they have become older. So that's basically what an average player will do. And then there are exceptions, but the most players will follow such a curve. And the final thing I will mention regarding details of the model is that we are adjusting for differences between leagues. And the way we do this is what makes it different than just a regularized regression model. So here we utilize the fact that we have changed this from a regularized linear regression model and into sort of an optimization model. And what regularization does is that it forces the ratings of players to become close to zero if we know little about the player. But this is a bad thing if you have a wide variety of leagues in your data set. Let's say you have the Premier League, but you also have League 2. So if you have a new player introduced in your data and this player appears in League 2, or the new player appears in the English Premier League, it doesn't make sense to push the rating of the player towards 0 in both cases. So instead, what we do is that we look at the teammates of a player, and we say that, okay, if we know little about the player, his rating or her rating will be pushed towards 0, but also towards the average rating of the teammates of that player. So this way we exploit sort of the fact that if a player appears on a team, we know something about the player, namely the fact that the player appeared on that particular team. So I have a few more slides before we go back to Garry. And I wanted to show this one just to highlight how we have been creating this plus-minus model. So basically, there have been two criteria that we've used when developing the plus-minus rating model. So up here in the top right corner, we have the current method that we will analyze. And then the other dots here correspond to sort of intermediate models that we have had. And here in the bottom left, we have sort of the pure plus-minus score that we discussed in the beginning. The two criteria that we use are, first of all, repeatability. So the higher, the better on this axis. And in this sense, repeatability is basically that we take our data set, we split it into two, we calculate the ratings on each of the two parts of the data set separately, and then we calculate the correlation between the ratings that we get out of that. So essentially, closer to 1 means there's a very good correlation, whether you calculate the ratings on one data set or another data set. And the other criterion that we use is the ability of using the ratings to predict outcomes of football matches. So essentially, if you know the ratings of the 11 players in the starting lineups of both teams, how accurately can you predict whether the match will end with a home, draw, or away win? So next slide, I just have using this rating method on a relatively large set of observations from recent matches. These are the best players according to this rating that we have. So it picks these 10 players as the top 10 out of more than 18,000 active players in that data set. So I call this a smell test. I think Garry will have a better name for this type of validation later. But of course, we expect to see good players here. We don't necessarily expect the model to be able to pinpoint exactly who is the best in the world. And there is some uncertainty, of course, in these ratings. So this is not a sort of a strict ranking. There's a level of statistical noise here in this rating. But for the most part, it seems to put players that we recognize as being good players in the top of the list. We can also look at the ratings over time of some players. Here I selected the Neymar, which was #1 in the current list. Messi, that has been #1 for a long time in the model. And I also chose Thomas Müller, which I think was #2, just to sort of show how their careers have looked like in terms of these ratings. They are typically climbing at the start of their career because of this age component that is included. So at this point, we sort of did a lot of work to develop a rating system. We didn't know whether we would succeed in creating a good rating system when we started this. But we wanted to see, because there were mixed reports in the blogosphere regarding plus-minus ratings for football players. Most people sort of have tried this and did not come up with reasonable results. So it looked like these results were more reasonable, but how reasonable? And that's where the analysis that Garry and I did together comes into play, I think. So next question that we have is sort of how do plus-minus ratings relate to event-based performance indicators, in a hope that this will sort of tell us more about what is it that these plus-minus ratings actually do. So now I have bored you for a long time, so I would like to give the microphone back to Garry. So please. And I will try to stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Lars. Okay, so as Lars said, you know, this by the way is the paper that came out of the collaboration. I've just got one slide here. I need to sort of explain what's sort of behind this slide. Our goal was to sort of look at the relationship between Lars's ratings and the event level data for those players over the same period, which was quite a 6 or 7 seasons, and to see, you know, what if any was the kind of overlap. So in order to do this, we used a sort of combination of, well, we used a regression model where the ratings were regressed upon various key performance stats derived from the event data, things like, you know, goals per 90 or tackles per 90, success, you know, passing accuracy, total passing length, pass value, you know, this kind of things that David reports in his radars. And we developed a separate regression model for each position: goalkeeper, defender, these are the ones listed at the top, defensive midfielder, midfielder, attacking midfielder, and forward. First thing to say is that there was quite a significant overlap between the event data and the PM ratings, but they were by no means the same thing. Typically, and it depended on position, but typically about 30% of the variance in PM ratings was shared with the event data. So in other words, you know, the event data could predict about 30% of the variance of the PM ratings, which means there is definitely, you know, a relationship there, but 2/3 of the variance remains unexplained. But we weren't expecting to get you know, 100% overlap by any means. Now, what I've got here on this slide, and you know, I'm not going to actually show you the regression equations. I'll just say that you know, for example, for forwards, the predictors, the event data predictors predicted 38% of the variance in PM ratings. But what I'm going to look at is the different KPIs we had down here. Different KPIs down here, and then the player positions over here. And what these entries are how important is each of these KPIs in predicting PM ratings. And if we look, for example, at the forwards, what are the key KPIs for predicting PM ratings in forwards? Well, it's goals scored per 90 and it's key passes per 90, which is, you know, what we were kind of hoping for. It will be something like that. The next biggest one was shots on target. So that's what a forward looks like. If you think of an attacking midfielder, then the most important KPIs for predicting their PM rating will be key passes per 90 and successful take-ons. Okay, again, that kind of makes sense. So it sort of begins to look as if we are sort of picking up something meaningful here. For defenders and defensive midfielders, the big thing is passing, successful passes per 90. If you look at sort of more complex things like, you know, how valuable those passes were in terms of some sort of goal probability added, that doesn't feature. It just seems to be the successful passes that count. So this was kind of encouraging, actually, that we were getting some sort of sensible kind of congruence between these two measures, which are sort of, you know, derived from totally different standpoints. So this gave us the impetus to look at the next step, which was, you know, can we combine these two types of ratings to develop a player rating that's more predictive of future performance, team performance, than the PM ratings alone. So I'm going to bring back Lars to talk about that, I believe. So yeah, if Lars can
talk
about that one.
I'll try to go back. So I need to catch up. Right. So the next step after looking at the sort of the relationship between plus minus ratings and these KPIs was to see if we could improve the plus minus rating by the information given in the KPIs. So the first thing we did was to run some models trying to predict match outcomes using different covariates. So in this case, we have 3 models presented here, and I'll just quickly point out what is important here. So model 1, oops, I thought I had clicked here. So model 1 is a model where we only use the plus minus ratings to try to predict outcomes of football matches. So the important figure here, I think, is the quadratic loss measure here. The quadratic loss is basically a measurement of how good the predictions are. And the lower the number, the better it is. And this is sort of done on an out of sample set of matches. So you're basically calculating the ratings up to a certain point in time, and then you're predicting the outcomes of the following matches. And then you're updating the ratings, and then you're predicting for the next set of matches, and so on. So this is kind of the benchmark here then, using just the plus minus ratings. Model 5 here is if we only use the KPIs to do predictions. And in that case, we see the quadratic loss here is higher, which means that the predictions are then worse. So if you're just going to predict outcomes of football matches, then the plus minus ratings are sort of better than the KPIs by themselves. But we would like to think that some of the KPIs could be beneficial. So we ran some tests where we built a model trying to improve on the predictions. And we found model 3 here, which had a better quadratic loss. It's only slightly better, right? So if you compare model 1 and 5, then you see that the difference is sort of 0.07 in terms of this quadratic loss. But if you compare model 1 and 3, then the difference is much smaller. And what we ended up with here then was a model that included the plus minus rating and 2 additional KPIs, which were the saves per 90 and the key passes per 90. So calculated per player and then aggregated together in the same way that the plus minus ratings are aggregated together when you try to predict the match outcome here. So based on this, this is not reported on the slides here, but it's written in the paper. We derived sort of 2 new versions of plus minus ratings that were combinations of plus minus and the KPIs. And these new versions were able to sort of slightly improve the predictions. And so we could probably say at that point that we had reached a better rating system, at least in terms of our measure of validity, which was how good we can predict or how well we can predict outcomes of future matches. So I think maybe I will now go back to Garry again to talk about sort of general characteristics of a good player rating system. So let me try to stop sharing again. Garry.
Okay, thanks, Lars. Oh, sorry. Here we are. Well, just to end up then, we'll talk a little bit more generally about player rating systems and what makes a good player rating system. I think, you know, people are talking about that everyone has their own rating system these days. I think it's important to sort of, you know, compare and contrast them and look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of them and so forth, and just to think about in general, you know, what we're looking for in a rating system. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the big things we need from a rating system is that it's reliable. What Lars called repeatability. If you find you have a measure that measures, say, player creativity, then if he's creative this Saturday, you want him to be equally creative next Saturday. You want your ratings to be stable, and this stability can be quantified by a metric called the reliability. The reliability of a metric is, well, if you square it, you get the amount of variability that is true score variability, and the rest will be noise. So if you think of any rating as consisting of a player's true rating, any sort of observed or computed rating consists of his true rating plus some noise. You obviously want the noise component to be as small as possible and the true score to be as big as possible. And reliability tells you about that. If you and I've put a figure on here of 0.7, basically because if you square 0.7, you get 0.5, near enough, and that means that any measure that has a reliability of 0.7, then at least 50% of the variability is true score variability. That number 0.7 is actually used a lot in psychometrics. Now, I don't know whether you can compare psychometrics with the type of rating systems we're concerned with here. But one of the things about VAEP, which came out in the Van Roy paper they talked about, was that the reliability of VAEP taken over one season is 0.25. No, not the reliability. The correlation between the split halves is 0.25. That corresponds to a reliability of 0.4. So what that means is that your VAEP for a one season is not a reliable measure. If you did it over, so if you're going to sort of report VAEP ratings, you should do it for maybe a couple of seasons at least to get some decent reliability on the measure. I guess you should subject all new rating systems to this kind of test. The other thing, Lars called it a smell test. Its official name is face validity. It means, does the results of the system, do they look right? An example of what is not face validity comes from a piece that was published in The Economist in 2019, which was the idea of the piece was to estimate the contribution of managers to team performance. And it was a splendid piece that looked at 596 managers over 15 seasons and came up with the conclusion that Carlo Ancelotti ranked 595th out of 596 managers. I would suggest this fails the face validity test. I mean, he's hundreds of places below Alan Shearer as a manager, even more hundreds of places below Tony Poulos. Tony Pulis is a pretty good damn manager, but you know, I don't think he's any Carlo Ancelotti. Certainly not, hundreds of places above. The other thing is content. What it's called content validity, and that means does the rating system measure what it purports to measure? So, and I think this is quite interesting in terms of the systems that we've been looking at. Things like the AP and PM rating. What exactly are we measuring here? Are we measuring the contribution of the player, or are we measuring the ability of the player? And that could be two different things. The ability we'd expect to be, you know, maybe less variable than the contribution, and so it, you know, and just requires, I think, maybe kind of thinking about that a little bit when we're talking about rating systems. What are we trying to measure? What is being measured? But the final thing, and the most important perhaps, is predictive validity. Can we use the ratings to predict future performance, either of teams and or of players? So those are the things that, you know, I think we should sort of look at whenever we see a new rating system, and just sort of run through those few things and see how it stacks up. That's it really for our presentation. So I'm going to hand back to David if I can. The end. Okay. How can I stop sharing? Okay.
That's perfect.
There's the man.
Yeah, I'm going to put it on this slide so we can have a discussion. I mean, to me, like, you've done a brilliant discussion of everything to do with the plus minus and the event data or whatever. And then your last slide for me is the kind of bombshell of all of this, because I've been involved for a long time looking on Twitter and seeing people writing these things. And also I do a lot of talking to coaches who always want to see player radars. They love, or scouts love player radars in my experience. And what you're saying, really, to boil it down, is that nothing out of all the player radars, all this VAAP, else, nothing is actually beating plus minus to any really strong degree just now. Am I making too strong a claim there, or because you're both very kind of conservative in your or careful in what you're saying here? So I'm just going to push you here, because the reason I wanted to have you on and talk about this is because actually, to me, your result was a sort of bombshell amongst all the way that's done with event data and with match result data.
I mean, I don't know how good a job we did with picking the you know, the best KPIs. I mean, I don't think we had XG in there, for example. I can't remember. But you know, we did do like this filtering process where we started off with a big bunch of them, and then we narrowed them down, the ones that didn't predict PM ratings. But you know, at the end of the day, we only looked at those when in Lars's model 5, we only looked at the event of the KPIs that were predictive of the PMs. So there were some other, you know, there are other KPIs that didn't sort of come into Lars's model 5 because they weren't related strongly to the plus minus. So you can't conclude that in every case plus minus will beat KPIs. No, you can't conclude that from what we did.
Okay, so you can't conclude in every, but you didn't find any evidence that the KPIs beat the plus minus in general?
No, we didn't. But
we didn't find any.
What I'm trying to say is we didn't examine all the KPIs that we started with. We only examined the KPIs that were related meaningfully to the plus minus ratings.
I'll chip in here. I think when we did the second test where we tried to improve the plus minus rating, we did include also the ones that were not shown in the slide that you presented.
Yes.
But we were, of course, left with only 2 KPIs that did improve on the predictive validity of the PM ratings. But I think, as you said, Garry, the KPIs are sort of basic versions, right? So I think we would like to continue this work comparing our plus-minus ratings also to the VAEP and other rating systems to see if we can gain more insight. Because if you look at it, if you have more information, you should be able to find better ratings. Otherwise, you are doing something wrong. So there's no doubt that, in principle, event or ratings based on event data should outperform plus-minus ratings for a certain size of the data set. But I guess no one has really gone to the effort of demonstrating this yet, is what we are at right at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think that's that is an important point actually. To get decent PM ratings, you need huge amounts of data. But you know, event level and KPI level ratings, you don't need that much. So, so there is a big difference there.
Yeah, Ed, a sort of question that sort of builds on top of that, which is, you know, Lars touched on uncertainty, you know, as being something that you would like to quantify in the PM ratings. How many, you know, from your experience working with these models, how many games or minutes would a player have to play before you feel like you have a an accurate assessment of what his or her PM rating is?
Yeah, I have never dared to sort of say a number to answer that. What we did a little bit in the paper as well is I think we did some bootstrapping technique where you basically take your data set and you sample a number of observations, possible with repeated observations, and then you calculate ratings many times, and then you can generate in principle confidence intervals for the ratings, and also confidence intervals for the difference in ratings between, let's say, 2 different players. So rather than saying that you should have this number of minutes, I would at least go that route and use some kind of statistical bootstrapping to provide an answer.
And, you know, from the perspective of, you know, applying this practically, you know, one of the things that, you know, I can imagine that scouts and coaches want to look at is, you know, we have a player who's going to leave or is aging. We want to replace them with a like-to-like player. Now, of course, your model is very much designed on sort of measuring player impact. You know, in what ways could it feed into that decision? If you wanted to say replace a specific fullback, would it be the case of just ranking all the fullbacks in your data by plus minus, or can you be sort of even more targeted than that?
I think in that particular case, you would like to have event data and tracking data and use those to get some similarities. Because the plus minus rating simply is a ranking, right? It's a rating number. It's a single number, and it doesn't really say much about the player.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can do without event data, really. We did talk, David, didn't we, about using some 12 data to.
Yeah, that was the player radar. The player radar you showed there is actually a weighted player radar. So it's not just the actions; it's weighted by their. Now we seem to be calling it VAEP, but it's weighted by a version of that model we have, which it says how important a pass was, and so my hope was when I sent that. It's actually work done by Fran, who's not here this evening. He made the radars, but the rankings of the 12 rankings, and my hope was that you could see if that gave any reasonable performance.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I hope we can actually sort of do that analysis. That would be good.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear this. I mean, I'm sort of open to the possibility that there isn't much way of these things better. What I like about yours, and you almost never see, is the fact that in the end you're predicting in the future, do you do better? do these players do better? And it's quite amazing that that is very seldom seen in the analytics world, that there's like, oh, look at this player radar, or oh, look at this ranking of this player, and so on. Oh, here's this table of these players, they're all so good. And you very seldom, how did they do a year later or 2 years later, and the follow-up. And that's what I really appreciate about your work.
Have you looked into using it for things like squad rotation? You know, when is the right time to rest certain players such that you don't sufficiently detract from your win probability? Because I guess you can tell exactly when you replace a player with another player who has a lower plus minus, but you're playing against a weak team anyway. So, you know, making that change shouldn't really affect the probability of winning.
This has been on my to-do list for a long time, basically looking at the scheduling effects and fatigue and things like that. So I think it would be fairly straightforward to expand the model, include some additional covariates to say sort of how rested are the players, and then be able to get the model to tell you how much is it worth to have arrested players. So much of the analysis done on that, I think, has been on the team level. But then, of course, if you don't compensate for the fact that maybe they are playing with the B-level team in certain matches, then you are missing sort of the true effect of having a tight schedule or having played a lot of matches in a short time span and so on. So I think that's a very interesting idea for me, at least.
Do you think, is there any evidence, or could you use the model for testing whether players have a certain special relationship? I always remember the York and Cole, you know, their relationship, their apparent relationship in the United's treble-winning season. Does that start just to add too many covariates into the model, or is it, do you think that with enough data, it's something you might be able to tease out as well?
I think you obviously can't add all interaction terms here. But if you have a hypothesis that you believe that these two players are very well together, then you could certainly add one variable for that pair of players and check if the model also agrees with that hypothesis, which is what, that's how I would suggest to use that, at least.
Yeah, interesting.
Can I ask, thinking about this, the whole Friends of Tracking project, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you guys on was to sort of take a step back, because we've been very excited and going forward with all these value-added possession, and of course there's a lot of research beforehand. But if somebody would like to implement a plus-minus model, is there an available data set which they can easily use to implement the methods in your articles, for example?
Right, so that's the big difference, right, between event data and tracking data and the data that we use in plus minus. That for event data and tracking data, you're basically unable to obtain data, at least for an affordable price, without sort of having a specific access. And the data sets that are there have been prepared, and sort of you are given these seasons for these leagues. For match sheet data, it's much more easy to find this data. Right? You Google or use any browser and search for a match, and you will find the information that you need from that match. The big challenge is to organize that data. And so far, I'm not aware of anyone that has sort of organized all the data, cleaned it, put it together in a nice format that allows you to sort of easily create such models as discussed here today.
Okay, so there isn't, so despite the fact that it is all openly available, there is no nice open data set.
Yeah, so you basically have to do the dirty work of obtaining and then cleaning the data.
Yeah.
I was about to ask, you know, which player in all history has had the highest plus minus rating?
In my system, that would probably be Messi.
Well, that's it would be wrong otherwise, wouldn't it? We would have to.
Well, if you could go all the way back to Pele, then, you know, maybe you could begin to answer that question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have data going back that far, at least not in enough amounts.
Maradona, is there any? How far do you go back in time?
Well, my problem is that it gets very sparse.
Okay.
So mostly 10 years back is quite full, and then before that it's it's not very full.
I did notice that Kyle Walker is better than Ronaldo. That's good to see.
Yeah, I should add that the model and the ratings there, there's this age effect. So Ronaldo is sort of past the age where he's supposed to have declined. So the model sort of gives a large weight on the fact that he should now be far below his peak. And that's why he's going quite far down the rankings.
Will all players have the same age, sort of aging curve, or is there a kind of a breakdown between position?
At the moment, it's just one aging curve for all the players. So probably it would make sense to say that defenders have a different aging curves than forwards, having a different aging curve than goalkeepers. But I didn't really make that at the time I tested this, which was a while back now. It didn't seem to make a positive impact on the ability of the ratings to predict future matches to sort of do this split. And that was kind of the target that I used for developing these rating system. So maybe there was not enough data.
This has been fascinating, but we've gone a long way past. So I normally blame Javier for talking all the time, so that's why we go past our allotted times. But I can't do that this evening. But it was really fascinating, actually, and really in depth. And I think this will form a kind of tutorial, really, of how to do the plus-minus models. And I hope that some of the people inside who've been following the videos start to maybe download and clean up this data and start implementing some of these models. But I think I think I'll wrap it up there. We have to just have a quick look at the illustration for this evening. Oh, who's that grumpy face there? Some people are scared with analytics, Garry. That's from lots of details there of the different things going in there, event level, global, latent variables. I enjoyed that bit with the latent variables. That's really nice, and we haven't really talked enough about that, reducing the complexity of data in these courses. So loads of stuff in there to think about. But other than that, it's been a really long and enjoyable session this evening. The exciting thing is that next week, this isn't kind of fully planned because it's the Spanish who are planning it, or the Catalans who are planning it. But next week, the idea is we're going to do some sort of thing on the Barcelona Innovation Hub, who also have a sort of rival YouTube channel. And we're going to do a joint thing together with them, where we're going to talk about football analytics, both in the normal way we do it, but to that they have there. Barcelona Innovation Hub have a very nice YouTube channel with lots of videos, mainly in Spanish, unfortunately for us non-Spanish speaking people. But hopefully we're going to be on there next Thursday. Then in 2 Thursdays time, we'll be back on here. And Mladen has said he's come in. We still haven't fully decided how we're going to announce the winner of the Liverpool challenge. I sort of expected 3 entries and we'd be able to find one of them, but it's kind of been overwhelming. So we'll have to discuss that. We'll go into that. We'll decide about that later. But otherwise, thank you very much to Garry for coming tonight. Thank you, Lars, and thank you, Laurie. And of course, thank you very much for Totti for recording for Prosperity this meeting. And otherwise,
thank you very much for sort of initiating the whole thing, as well as just, obviously for this evening and inviting us, but more importantly, getting this channel going and so forth. And for Laurie and Totti for supporting it.
Okay, well, thanks. That's very nice of you. It's a lot of fun to do. Great. Okay. Bye-bye. I'm going to stop the live stream. See you later.